there's so much of this dissonant stuff going on in these scenarios, right? It's like it's dripping with dissonance.
Yeah, it's a fire hose of dissonance. Yeah.
Well, welcome everyone back to the Manipulation Check. We've been away for a little while, but we're back with a very interesting topic for today. Jeff, why don't you bring us into this episode?
All right, thanks, Dan. It's good to be back. So I was thinking about this. It's basically been a year since we started this podcast.
Oh, wow.
So happy anniversary, Dan.
Oh, happy anniversary.
So this is our 1 year. I'm pretty much close to our 1 year anniversary. And in that year since we started, a lot has changed. A lot continues to change and will probably continue to change for some time now. Just where we are anyways, in Ontario, Canada, there's no longer any mandates really to speak of. There's still some in some workplaces, so hospital settings and healthcare. But generally speaking, workplace mandates aren't very common anymore. We don't have vax passports for restaurant venues, travel. There's really no testing to speak of. And a lot of the excitement, the frenzy, the fervor around COVID and around the policies has really died down as well. So a lot has changed. It's almost hard to find something that hasn't changed, unless you're in one of those workplaces where, mandates were there last year and they're still there this year. But to go down the list of things with respect to COVID and policies, it's hard to find something that's the same now as it was, January 2022.
Yeah, and some of the information that is becoming sort of well-known has changed as well. So, for instance, early on, we had those really high predictions of the mortality rate. Remember the Imperial College London models, right? A lot of people were going to die. Turns out that the death rate was much lower. We had this idea that the vaccines that were released were going to prevent infection and spread, and now we know maybe that's not quite true. They're pretty leaky. The vaccines were supposed to be impressively safe, and there may be some safety signals starting to emerge over time. I remember there was the idea of naturally acquired immunity. Remember that? Which
I remember it, and then I forgot it, and I think I'm remembering it again.
Yeah, that's right. So it was supposed to be very short-lived and certainly much poorer than the vaccine-induced immunity. And now, of course, we know there's lots of data out there showing maybe that the reverse is true, that naturally acquired immunity is pretty good. There was this notion that lockdowns were going to have a net benefit, and now there might be data that, all things considered, actually, there might be a lot of costs that we've incurred because of lockdowns. And maybe is there really a net benefit in the end? School closures, right? We now know that maybe they weren't that necessary, and we have this huge deficit in learning right now. And I mean, we can go on and on. Cloth masks, right? I mean, they were in and they were out and they were in. So yeah, the list is pretty long.
Maybe, yeah.
Things are changing, like you say. And now the big question is are people's views, beliefs, and perspectives in general also changing?
Yeah. So how have people been making sense of this change? And I think what some people are struggling with or are faced with, they're seeing quite a bit of, is trying to make sense of how other people are making sense of the change. Why is it that some people are maybe a little slow on the uptake of some of this information and are maybe resistant to updating their beliefs in the face of new information? So that really leads us into the topic for the day. And to really read us into it, I'm gonna start with I'm gonna read a couple quotes from a seminal book on the topic we're going to be talking about. Because we love the classics on the Manipulation Check, and this is a classic. This is from 1956.
Ooh.
Okay, so this really speaks to the question we're trying to address today. It starts, a man with conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree and he turns away. Show him facts or figures and he questions your sources. Appeal to logic and he fails to see your point. Suppose an individual believes something with his whole heart. Suppose further that he is committed to this belief, that he has taken irrevocable actions because of it. Finally, suppose that he is presented with evidence, unequivocal and undeniable evidence that his belief is wrong. What will happen? So what will an individual do? What do individuals do in this particular context?
Yeah, and the context in that situation is you've committed a lot to one course of action or to one set of beliefs, and then you're faced with disconfirming evidence. What do you do? Yeah.
What do you do? And in this particular instance, this is a very extreme, strong case of this because the evidence is undeniable and unequivocal. So there's a question under these circumstances what somebody would do. It's not obvious what somebody's going to do. And what happens is generally something that's pretty counterintuitive, or some options that are pretty counterintuitive of what people can do. And this is a lot of where the cognitive dissonance literature started. This is effectively the types of questions, or the question that was looked at to try and understand the process. And what this led to was this idea of cognitive dissonance. And it's a huge literature in social psychology. I think it's the biggest one.
Really?
I think there's some statements out there, the extent to which is the biggest. It's been around for a while. It's been researched a lot, so it's huge.
Yeah.
So do you want to take us into some of the specifics?
Yeah. Well, let's talk
about the theory.
Let's talk about some of the basics of the theory. So, as you mentioned, Jeff, dissonance as a concept, and I guess now an enduring theory in social psychology, was formulated maybe first and popularized in a seminal book that was published in 1957. So just after the date that you gave there, and the title of the book was A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance, and I have it right here. And the author was Leon Festinger. Okay, so that's the name you want to remember, Leon Festinger. And he was examining these sorts of situations. In fact, what's interesting is if you look at the preface of the book, you learn that some of this work was actually funded by the Behavioral Science Division of the Ford Foundation.
A small mom and pop shop.
Yeah, that's right. And they were trying to get an inventory of the substantive area of, and I'm quoting here, communication and social sciences. And they wanted to consider the literature on mass media. And Festinger was particularly interested in rumor spreading. So they went into the literature that was available at the time about communication, social influence, and they started to derive like a theory, and that ultimately became the dissonance theory, a theory of cognitive dissonance, and it went from there. And so here are some of the key postulates of the theory. Okay, so these are the ones to remember. So the first postulate, I'm going to just quote directly from the book because Festinger provides a really good summary here. And he writes, the basic background of the theory consists of the notion that the human organism tries to establish internal harmony, consistency, or congruity among his opinions, attitudes, knowledge, and values. That is, there is a drive toward consonance among cognitions. Okay, so you want to be consistent. And by the way, the term cognition that he uses here refers to opinions, very broadly, opinions, attitudes, knowledge, and values. Okay, and you want to be consistent.
Category.
Yeah. So the second postulate is that when a person realizes there is an inconsistency among their cognitions, and we can also include behaviors, which by the way is referred to as cognitive discrepancy, they'll experience a type of negative affect, which is referred to as dissonance discomfort, or sometimes just the word dissonance. So when people use the word dissonance, they mean this negative affect. That's the result of this cognitive discrepancy that people experience. And Festinger, by the way, used dissonance for both the cognitive discrepancy and the dissonance discomfort, which led to some confusion. But we want to make sure that those are separate.
Yeah. So it's specifically the discomfort in the face of inconsistency.
Yeah, and that drives you now to do something about it. But before we get there, the third point I want to make is that the degree of dissonance discomfort is proportional to the amount of cognitive discrepancy. And it can depend on several factors, and the chief factors might include the number of inconsistent versus consistent cognitions. And the related factor there is the importance of the cognitions. So more dissonant for more important cognitions, more important topics. And just thinking about COVID, right? That's an important topic. So you can imagine that depending on how the cognitive discrepancy falls out, people might experience a lot of dissonance in that context, especially when you have a lot of change over time. And so that brings us to the fourth point, which is that since this dissonance discomfort is aversive, people will try to reduce this dissonance discomfort. And this can take a variety of forms depending on the situation. So one way you could deal with it is you can change your cognitions, your behaviors, or even your environment. So there, the distance might be so high, you just make some changes to what you believe and how you behave. But there are other things that you can do, including, and here's a quote from Festinger actually, ignoring or counteracting the real situation. So you're confronted with new information and you're like, I'm just going to ignore that. And maybe the mass media helps us to some extent because they say, well, that's fake news, or that's off bounds. Those are conspiracy theories, or that's a channel that you shouldn't listen to.
Yeah, or certain things get coverage, other things never do.
Never do. That's right. Yeah. You can also seek new and probably mostly consonant information. You can also avoid, and I'm quoting Festinger again, situation and information which would likely increase the dissonance. So you just avoid situations. Mm-hmm. So maybe you avoid those people you disagree with. You can also seek out people who hold consonant views. And I'm reminded of the term, the echo chamber, right? So people surround themselves by people who agree with what their itching ears want to hear, and they create an echo chamber. Yeah. And that supports it's constant information supports their prior beliefs, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It eliminates the possibility of dissonance, and then it could also remove existing dissonance. So it's preventative as well as what's the other one? Treatative.
Treatative. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think we can add one more to the list here of things you can do to reduce dissonance. This one's very interesting. Festinger writes a lot about this, actually. You can bias the interpretation of potentially dissonant information. Here's a quote from Festinger. You can follow a circuitous line of reasoning which ends in misunderstanding. So you'll kind of look at the information and you'll do some gymnastics and you'll misunderstand exactly what it says, and that is usually in a way that's consistent with your prior beliefs, right?
Yeah.
You can convince yourself that if you process the message, that the message is invalid. So it's kind of like ignoring it, but here you're processing it and you're just saying it doesn't apply to me. This relates, I think, to these broad areas that are now pretty well developed in cognitive psychology, which is one of the areas that looks at the phenomenon known as confirmation bias, and also just the broad concept of motivated reasoning. So your motivations bias the way that you process information and the evidence so that you come up with a conclusion more consistent with your prior beliefs. And so what I found fascinating, Jeff, is that this was all discussed in Festinger's book under this notion of dissonance.
1957.
1957. That's right.
Covers a lot of territory with respect to some of these literatures.
Yeah.
A few other ones I want to read off of that some of which will overlap with the ones Festinger mentioned, but some broader categories that were presented in a 2017 paper about what does somebody do, how do you reduce dissonance. Just broad categories I think are useful descriptors would be, one is distraction and forgetting. So you distract yourself from the dissonant information, or you conveniently forget. Another one is act rationalizations. So if you did something that's causing dissonance, you could rationalize the act away. Yeah, but I did it for X, Y, and Z reasons that I was totally justified in doing it. Another big one is just denial. So denial of responsibility for the act. Like there's some reason why it wasn't my fault, or I maybe even go so far. It's a little bit less mainstream. Maybe go so far as like that never happened.
Yeah.
So the extent of the denial, maybe.
Yeah, that reminds me of that concept that we were talking about, unethical amnesia.
You're right.
where you tend to forget your prior unethical actions, but not other people's prior unethical actions. But you mentioned that maybe that was not replicated in the literature. So
there's some interesting, there's some findings there, and then there's a replication of it that didn't find the support.
Okay.
But that
so maybe it's true, maybe it's not true.
Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Yeah. Those, I just wanted to get those out there as additional strategies to kind of illustrate like the scope of the possibilities for reducing dissonance or the options that somebody has at their disposal. And this isn't even comprehensive, so there could be other things that people do as well that aren't covered off in these.
Yeah.
These are what's been researched generally.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we can go through some main scenarios that lead to this dissonant discomfort, and then discuss maybe some examples from the COVID pandemic, and also talk about ways that people can deal with that dissonance discomfort in those situations, or the way that they have dealt with it.
So before we do that, I wanted to indicate how, or read off of how Aronson, so I think he was a student of Festinger, how he describes dissonance. I thought it was quite helpful for me to understand what it is. It's quite simple the way he describes it. He describes it as an unpleasant drive state, and he likens it to like hunger, thirst, or pain,
or boredom.
So that's what's that?
Or boredom.
Or boredom. There you go. So yeah, that's another way. So it's not necessarily just like, you have these like conflicting ideas. I think one thing and I also think another thing, and they're not quite compatible, but it's actually the feeling that it generates can be quite unpleasant.
Yeah, and with all those states as well, those feelings are very functional because they signal to the organism that there might be something that's wrong or something needs to be done.
Compels, I think that drive state is a good term, because it's not you're not just gonna, you could, but you're not necessarily gonna be sitting with it. Something's gonna happen. Something's gonna change. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
You ready for some scenarios?
Yeah, let's do some scenarios.
You got some examples ready there?
What one do you want to start with? You want to start with the big one?
Yeah, let's start with the big one. So the big one we can call and I think other authors have called it this, Harmon Jones and Mills, the belief disconfirmation scenario. The scenario occurs when a person encounters information that's inconsistent with that person's prior views or behavior. So it's like the example that you've mentioned before. Give us some examples here, Jeff, from the pandemic of this scenario.
So before we do that, can I talk about the cult?
Oh yeah, you could talk about the cult. Yeah.
Do you want me to talk about the cult?
Yeah, you can talk about the cult. Yeah.
So the quote I read off from the beginning was from this book. I think it's by Festinger, Reichen, and Schachter, 1956. And the title of the book gives it away. It's called When Prophecy Fails.
Ooh.
So what do people do when you have this prophecy? You have this belief, you have a prediction of what's going to happen, something's going to happen, and then it doesn't happen. What do you do? And the book was actually, it's sort of an expose or an analysis of effectively a cult. So there used to be, I don't think you hear about them too much anymore, but you kind of get these cults that used to spring up around different ideas about the end of the world coming at different times. And this particular cult was sort of brought up around this lady who predicted that there was going to be this cataclysmic flood that was going to end the world. And she found out this information from aliens. The aliens told her. She was doing this, what is it called? Like, I think it's free writing or something like that, where you're getting messages and you're just scribbling them down on the piece of paper, and it leads to all these predictions. So
Carl Jung, by the way, Carl Jung used to do that.
Is it called free writing? Did I get that right?
I think he called it automatic writing.
Automatic writing. Okay, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So all good ideas come from this.
That's right.
So anyway, there's this cult that springs up around. There's going to be this. The world's going to end on a certain day at a certain time, and if you're in the know, you can go to this spot, and the aliens are going to come and save you. So you can be saved by the aliens, and everybody else is gonna perish in the flood. So if you're in the know, you could get saved by the aliens, and if you're on the unfortunate side of being a non-believer, then you're gonna perish with everybody else.
So the aliens are good. These are good.
The aliens are good. Yeah, the aliens are gonna save. Yeah,
I like,
but
the good
only
aliens.
if you follow the tenets of the leader and of the
course.
cult. So this was a context that sprung up where it was an ideal circumstance to basically test some of these ideas and this theory. So what do people do when fake? Because the idea is, okay, the aliens aren't going to come. They're pretty certain that the aliens aren't going to come, and they want to be there. The researchers want to be there through the process, sort of track it, be there at the build up as well as at the end when the prophecy fails, and then what do people do? How do people handle that? And then how does that feed into the predictions and the ideas of the theory, and what does that teach us about human behavior and what people do in these situations? So it's a whole book, over 200 pages, basically walking through this scenario, and the names and the dates and things are changed for anonymity purposes, but the general outline of the situation is one where, like I said, it's basically a prediction of a cataclysm, a lot of death, and a few people are going to get saved. And it's particularly interesting to think about in the context of COVID, because some people have likened COVID to a cult. So I'm thinking of like C.J. Hopkins' work. I think he might have coined the phrase COVIDians, like branch COVIDians. So you get these ideas. Maybe he was satirizing people who are really dedicated to COVID and the
interventions.
What's that?
So and the interventions, right? So you've got this big cataclysm coming. The COVID's going to wipe out humanity, or a big chunk of it. And so you have to religiously adhere to certain preventative measures, right?
Yeah.
And primarily those involve like locking down, taking a vaccine, and maybe masking and staying certain feet apart or something like that, right? And if we all do that, and the other interesting thing about that is that if we all do that, then we'll be saved.
We'll be saved. You're going to be saved. Yeah. So it's not hard to find the parallels. So the COVID's going to kill everybody. You can even go back to the predictive models you mentioned, how devastating it was going to be. And, one of the saviors was going to be the vaccine. The vaccine was going to save everybody. If you took it, you're going to be saved. If you didn't take it, you weren't. We recall those statements of President Biden. You're going to be in a winter of death and destruction. Right. Like it's going to be death. It's going to be lots of death. You're going to be calling 911. No one's going to answer because the hospitals are going to be filled with the unvaccinated and all these things. So it's not too big a stretch to find the predictive parallels from one context to the next. But we don't need to get into the specifics. A lot of the book is dedicated to the specifics of the cult and the nature of the predictions, and it was from this planet Clarion and stuff like that. So we don't need to get into all that kind of stuff. But it is kind of an interesting read. It can be a bit tedious, but it's a pretty interesting read. But I think some of the most interesting stuff for our purposes comes when the authors are laying out the tenets of the theory and what will happen. And I think this is particularly powerful in the context of the pandemic. So they're talking about the conditions necessary for increased fervor in the presence of disconfirmation. So it's a nice theory where they're going to say, okay, if these things are present, that's going to lead to people effectively doubling down when they get confronted with disconfirming information. So when they're not saved by aliens, the vaccine doesn't work the way it said, people aren't dying as much as people thought they were. What's that going to do?
Yeah.
So here are the 5 things they listed at the beginning that are going to lead to increased fervor. First one is the belief must be held with a deep conviction. It must have some relevance to action. That is to what a believer does or how he behaves. So you got to care about it. You have to do stuff in response to the belief. The belief has to have some teeth, effectively. Now here's the second one. The second one is particularly powerful in the context of COVID, I think. The person holding the belief must have committed himself to it. That is, For his belief, he must have taken some important action. Here it is, that is difficult to undo. In general, the more important such actions are, the more difficult they are to undo, the greater the individual's commitment to the belief.
So like vaccination would be one that you just like it. You're done. You're taking a thing.
You take it. You can't untake it. You can't untake it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very, very relevant to COVID. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Say you're even in, depending on your occupation, your job, you implemented some policy. You made some administrative decisions. You fired people, let's say, because of lack of adherence to certain policies. You've done things you can't undo necessarily, or maybe you could but they're difficult to undo. You did certain things, right. You can't take them back.
You were the executant in the Milgram paradigm.
Exactly. We're talking to the executants out there. Okay, so those are the first two. The third one, the belief must be sufficiently specific and sufficiently concerned with the real world so that events may unequivocally refute the belief. So this is almost less of a condition about the individual, more of like what's required for the conditions to actually be met. So there has to be the possibility of basically refutation, pretty clear refutation. So you're saying the aliens are going to come not in a dream, let's say, for example, but they're going to come to a specific place, to a specific location. It's going to happen or it's not going to happen. So for example, it's going to be a winter of death and destruction. So this coming winter, it's going to be a lot of death, a lot of destruction. So when the winter comes and goes and there is or there isn't death and destruction, you could say confirmed, not confirmed.
Or when X amount of the population has been vaccinated, then the virus will be stopped dead in its tracks. Exactly. And it'll be eradicated from. Exactly. Or like, zero COVID, right? Like, no COVID whatsoever. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then number 4, such undeniable disconfirmatory evidence must occur and must be recognized by the individual holding the belief. So the disconfirmation basically has to be recognized by the person. If it's not recognized or not acknowledged, not seen, then it doesn't count. So just more technical stuff around what's required for this scenario. And the 5th one, this is a big one. The individual believer must have social support. It is unlikely that one isolated believer could withstand the kind of disconfirming evidence we have specified. If, however, the believer is a member of a group convinced of persons who can support one another, we would expect that the belief to be maintained and the believers to attempt to persuade non-members of the group that the belief is correct. So that's a big one. The presence of social support. If people are isolated and they face disconfirming information, even if they've done the irrevocable acts and they believe it strongly, they're less likely to double down, to have their increased fervor than if they were actually a member of this group. So it's very clear, it's very nice, it gives very specific predictions very specific prediction as to what's going to happen under these situations. So somebody runs down all the dissonance options. They're confronted directly with the fact that their belief that they strongly believed in, that they did stuff they can't take back for, is wrong. What do? The prediction with this theory, if those conditions are present, this theory says, you know what they're going to do? They're going to double down.
Even in the face of blatant disconfirming
it's
evidence.
Necessary. If it's not blatant, they're not going to double down. So the more unequivocal it is, the more you're going to see the double down. Yeah. Which is fascinating. And guess what? Spoiler alert, that's basically what they found with this group.
With this cult.
So with this cult, with the aliens coming, they basically found disconfirmation happens. They did see evidence of, other dissonance reduction strategies. So, rationalizing, for example, or coming up with new predictions, like updating the predictions, like, okay, no, this is going to happen now. And then so they kind of keep things going that way. So different things happened. But ultimately, in the face of the disconfirming information, having all these conditions present, what happens? The group members try and recruit additional group members. That's in this context, that's the double down.
Proselytizing.
Exactly. Yeah. Try and get more people to join. And if you can get more people to join your group, that's going to act to reduce the dissonance that's caused by the disconfirmation in this particular context. And we see that, I think, in spades in the pandemic. Mm-hmm. where you get the situation of, for example, somebody who's very, very pro-vaccine, let's say a public figure, a politician, somebody who's, you know, part of the CDC or one of these agencies, pushing it. They get COVID, and then what do they say? It's really important that everybody stays up to date on their vaccines.
They double down.
You double down. Yeah.
That's right. Triple, quadruple vaccinated, you get COVID. Well, and then you see the interesting rationalization, right? Well, if I didn't have the vaccine, I might be dead or in the hospital, right? So there's this other counterfactual that's created,
which is all consistent with dissonance theory as well.
That's exactly it. Yeah, you try to minimize the dissonance by manipulating the alternative, or by, in this case, bringing or manufacturing an alternative, right? Counterfactual.
Exactly. And then when ultimately faced with it, you say, well, everybody needs to do this.
Yeah.
And so on. So a really, I think, good example of how some behaviors that people see, just you're looking at me like, this doesn't make any sense. Like logically, people are saying, you know what, this is totally illogical. And according to dissonance theory, early days seminal stuff, 1956, it's like, yeah, that's exactly predictable. We knew this in 1956.
Yeah, and including factors like the social group, right? So in various circles, there has come to be an accepted belief about COVID, about how to stop COVID and so on. And so now you have this big social group, and maybe it's supported even by the media, by government messaging. So it creates this whole bulwark of consonant cognitions. And then you've engaged in a whole lot of consonant behaviors. So you have the social group, you've got all these different elements, you've committed a lot. And so now when the evidence starts to be coming out to be disconfirming your perspective, you're going to do a lot of gymnastics. And the most obvious one that's going to be interesting is you're going to actually double down. You're going to now say, so maybe you'll say, you know, we want these mandates to continue. They must continue, right? Yeah. Because you become even more fervent in that direction.
Exactly. And you're going to see it exactly from the people who are most committed. Right? Exactly from the people who had the strongest beliefs, who maybe did the most things that you can't take back. So they're going to, the more extreme they're going to have been in the past, that's going to, according to this framework, that's going to sort of strengthen the likelihood or increase the likelihood that they're going to double down.
Okay. So Jeff, I have a counterexample of a case. So I want you to go through other examples too, if you have them, but I just want to mention a counterexample where there was someone who was actually very committed to the whole COVID narrative and supported the COVID narrative, but ultimately changed their beliefs. Actually, there's a number of these people, right? So something made it so that they didn't actually double down, even though maybe that their social circle was heavily involved and so on. And the person I'm thinking of is UK cardiologist Aseem Malhotra. So at first, he's an ardent and enthusiastic proponent of the vaccine. He went on their national TV in the UK promoting the vaccination, and all seemed to change. At least he attributes the beginning of his process of changing his view when his otherwise healthy father died of cardiac problems after taking the mRNA COVID shot. So his father, I think, was also a medical practitioner, very healthy. He takes one of the shots and then all of a sudden develops his heart problem and dies very quickly. So you can think about this from a dissonance perspective, right? Because that event of the father dying would have created a substantial amount of dissonance in Malhotra, right? So what he could do is he could double down and say, well, it could have been a lot worse if he hadn't taken the vaccine. No. He could still try to justify the use of the vaccine and say, well, there are some cases, or he could say, maybe it wasn't the vaccine. Maybe we got it all wrong. It wasn't the vaccine that killed him. So he could have done some things. But instead, because Malhotra he's a well-published cardiologist, so he's also a scientist, right? Like a medical practitioner scientist. What he decided to do is to dig into the literature about these vaccines and to look more closely at the trials, which is very interesting because it implies that initially, he didn't actually do all that much digging, right? And so even it's a fascinating thing that even the experts will just accept the narrative,
right? Yeah.
And base all their constant cognitions on this surface narrative.
Why may they do that? Because that information will be consonant with their previous beliefs with respect to the situation on the ground.
That's right. And maybe it just takes too much effort to get to the fundamental information. Maybe you don't want to know the disconfirming information because that'll create more dissonance. So you're just like, I'll just leave it to the side.
Yeah.
But
so he got placed in an unpleasant drive state and
unpleasant
maybe compelled
drive state
him to investigate further.
That's right. So he investigated further, and during his investigation, he found information that was obviously inconsistent with his prior beliefs. And he published several papers on this. I think one of them being quite prominent now, showing that even actually from the initial trials for some of these vaccines, the evidence really didn't support their efficacy. And he's making the argument that maybe the costs outweigh the benefits, at least for some age groups. And ultimately, he's changed his tune on these vaccines, and he's suggesting that we got to reconsider them strongly. So there's an example of somebody faced with dissonance, but then. And maybe it might have been particularly his scientific mindset, right? So it kicked in, and he sort of dug into the evidence and then was compelled by the evidence because the mass of inconsistent information with his prior belief was just so large based on the reality of the data that he ended up changing his perspective. Mm-hmm. So then he goes out. Just let me add one more level, right? So then, of course, he goes out into the public, and he now confesses his new perspective. Well, now that's a problem for some people because he's creating dissonance in other people. He becomes the inconsistent fact promoter, right there. And so then, what's interesting to see is how the community starts to deal with that kind of a dissonance. So right away, you see the fact checkers kick in. Okay. And so you see fact checks on him.
That's the white blood cells come and try and remove the dissonant information from the narrative.
That's right. Because it might cause other people to start to get all concerned and having these negative drive states.
Everybody's in a negative drive state. Everybody's thirsty. Everybody's hungry.
Exactly. You don't want that, right? So I just want to read a little bit from this fact check. Okay. So this is this is factcheckafp.com. So here's what they write. The finding, they're talking about his paper as well. They're trying to discredit or disconfirm his published paper, peer-reviewed paper. The findings were further amplified of this paper in articles and posts from organizations that AFP has previously found to spread vaccine misinformation. Oh. Right, so right away they're walling off this category of sources is going to provide dissonant information that's bad. Don't go there, and it's because it's wrong. It's wrong information, right? So including the Children's Health Defense, Epoch Times, Gateway Pundit. On October 3rd, 2020, Malhotra appeared on an online program hosted by Del Bigtree, CEO of the Anti-Vaccination Informed Consent Action Network. So, see, they're not dealing... later on, they deal with some of the claims. Mm-hmm. But right at the beginning of this fact check, they're not actually dealing with Malhotra's claims.
Yeah.
They're trying to essentially associate him or point out that he's associated with these bad actors. And so, therefore... his information's invalid.
Yeah. Right? And for some, that might be enough. So if you want to sort of alleviate people's dissonance in the face of this information, the broad brush of, not credible, disreputable sources, it's like maybe that's enough for some people. That's like, okay, I don't even need to read anymore. I don't need to delve any deeper. This source that I deem credible said that source is not credible, so the dissonance just immediately dissipates. That's
right. And in fact, digging into that and actually looking at the claims and assessing the claims may produce a lot more dissonance, which you don't want.
Yeah.
So you're just not
motivated.
You don't
want to go there. Yeah. Just get rid of it right away. Yeah.
That's right.
Prevent the...
Yeah. And if you just go few sentences lower, this right away, what's interesting is they provide constant information in this fact check. Okay. So they say vaccines are the best way to protect people from COVID-19 and have already saved tens of thousands of lives, said Alison Cave, Chief Safety Officer at UK's Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA, in a statement emailed to AFP on October 6th.
So there you have the consonant information actually works to almost create more dissonance in a way, because you're saying, well, or it's creating dissonance for one side of the aisle, right? So how could it be that a vaccine that saved so many lives also be dangerous?
Right.
That's dissonant information. That's going to create dissonance, right? So two pieces of information are inconsistent with one another. It's unsafe, but it's also incredibly safe and effective.
That's right. Yeah, and right away you have to get this idea, quote from an expert, to reaffirm the consonant information, right? The consistent information. So
yes, yeah.
So see the manipulations here, right? As you go through the fact check should say, okay, here's one claim, and here's the evidence that contradicts that claim that Malhotra made. And they do a little bit of that later on, although they kind of, you could tell that that's another whole lesson in interesting reasoning. But here you see the maneuvers here that can be well understood from a dissonance perspective.
That's fascinating. And not even before even getting to the facts, like you said.
Yeah.
The fact check is doing the manipulations before the facts.
Yeah. You can think of mass media as a curator and manipulator and influencer of dissonance consonance dynamics. Mm-hmm. They'll present you information to, in some cases, create dissonance, in other cases, to rule out dissonance, depending on what direction they want you to go.
Exactly. Yeah. And dissonance is a established manipulation technique to get people to change their behaviors, depending on what the behavior is, if it's deemed to be desirable or not. So you induce dissonance to invoke a behavior change in one particular way.
Yeah, yeah. And just let me add very quickly here, just reminded me, later on in the fact check, they address one point made by Malhotra. So Malhotra talks about this idea that what's been widely publicized is the relative risk ratio of when it comes to these vaccines, right? So when you compare the placebo group in the initial trials and the vaccinated group, they do this relative risk assessment, which they say implies that these vaccines are about 95% effective. But you can also look at the absolute risk ratio, because obviously the people who developed clinical symptoms in those initial trials, which had in each group like 22,000 people in the Pfizer study, there was like in 100 people versus like 12 or 13 people who developed COVID across those two conditions. So very few people actually ended up getting sick in those two conditions. So if you look at the absolute risk reduction across groups, it's less than 1%. So it's very interesting. You could take the same data and you can emphasize the relative risk ratio and say, whoa, these things are really effective. Yeah. Or you can look at the absolute risk ratio and say these things are not very effective, right? Like they're not going to have that much of an impact.
One's consonant, one's dissonant.
Yes, that's right. And so right there, it's another example of you've got the same data and you can interpret it in a way that's consonant with your view, and you can interpret it in the way, and somebody else will interpret it in a way that's consonant with the opposite view. Exactly.
Depending on their underlying pre-existing belief, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what we've seen. People who generally are critical of the vaccines are always harp on the absolute risk ratio, and those people who want to promote the vaccines harp on the relative risk ratio. Mm-hmm. There you have it.
Yeah. And with this type of information, what's slightly different than let's say the cult situation, or at least it can appear like it's different than the cult situation, is sort of related to points 3 and 4 about how undeniable the disconfirmation has to be. And I think arguably you could find some wiggle room, or in some situations or circumstances you can find some wiggle room, saying it's like for some people it's undeniable, for other people like I don't know, because you can always interpret the relative or the absolute. Right. So with some of this stuff, there's always, it's harder to sort of corner somebody unequivocally or absolutely.
Yes, that's right. because there's wiggle room in the data. The data is got, I mean, right now we have lots of problems, right? Because there aren't any continuing large, proper, double-blind, clinical trials with random assignment, all that kind of stuff, right? It's just now like natural observation, data collection, which has flaws in it, throughout. So you can always either harp on the positives or harp on the flaws and support different perspectives.
And I think even from this perspective, from observers of other people's behavior, you could say, well, from one person's perspective, the information is undeniable, like it's undeniably refuted from one person's perspective. Another person's perspective might be like, you know what? I don't know. I'm not really, I'm not really convinced. I think the jury's still out on that. Or even if somebody is somewhat amenable to a certain perspective, they may not see something as being undeniable as somebody else. But that's not to say that certain things aren't ever undeniable. Like there is some things that are pretty undeniable. I think at this point. So
yeah. Do you have any other COVID examples of this scenario?
I think one of the ones that stands out in particular with respect to let's say the prophecy not being fulfilled is the arrival of boosters. So I think the arrival of boosters is a particularly strong illustration of the aliens not coming.
Yeah.
Or the aliens not coming maybe in the way that they were supposed to come.
In terms of the effectiveness of the boosters.
Yeah, if it was going to be the savior,
right,
and then the rollout of the booster sort of capitulates. You know what? Okay, maybe it wasn't gonna be everybody. So there's many there's many examples like that to highlight. Do you want to talk about some of the other paradigms, or do you have any other examples under the belief disconfirmation?
Maybe just a quick one that maybe is worth talking about, and maybe it's a special case of this sort of bigger belief disconfirmation scenario, and involves the situation in which you have a social group, and then you have a prominent person within that group who dissents. Okay, so Maholtram might be a case like that, but I'm thinking of a case maybe closer to home, which might be the vaccinologist, Professor Byron Bridle. And because he very early on is a very prominent vaccinologist within the scientific community, and he spoke out early on. And so what's interesting here is that the dissenting information in this case comes from a person within the group. And the expertise of this individual seems to matter with regard to how people respond. Okay, so Festinger writes the following: if the person voicing disagreement is seen as expert or very knowledgeable on such matters, the dissonance between knowledge of his contrary opinion and one's own opinion will be greater. Okay, so that person, if they're prominent in the group, will create a large amount of dissonance. And Festinger notes that on the extreme, what people will try to do in that group is to expel that disagreeing person from the group, okay, especially if they are a very prominent member. And he writes about one case, he says, quote, there was evidence of derogation and rejection of the persistent disagreeer. They try to get rid of him. And so again, I'm thinking of Byron Bridle, who raised the concerns about the safety and the efficacy of the COVID vaccines shortly after their release. And after making the public statements that contradicted the accepted view, he, was publicly criticized, scorned, attacked. He was ostracized by his colleagues. I mean, I think we should try to get him on our show to tell us a little bit about his experience. Mm-hmm. And I mean, because it was extreme, like the way he was treated by his immediate colleagues and the scientific community. Yeah. And it's because he created a mass amount of dissonance. The way you deal with that is expel the dissenter.
Right. And he's one where he'll appeal naturally, like you'd want to do, to his expertise.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is it's precisely because of his expertise that led to or leads to the magnitude of the scorn.
That's right.
Yeah, that if you didn't have that expertise, he wouldn't be.
It wouldn't be consequential. He'd just be that ridiculous guy on the side here making some bizarre points. Just ignore him, right?
Yeah.
But no, if he's an expert, you got to take him down.
Yeah. Yeah. And you have more incentive and more motivation to do that.
Yeah.
This is also consistent with some work, or just the ideas that were around in the 1950s. So in one of these review chapters on dissonance I looked at, there's this researcher Aronson. He outlined basically 4 things that were known by researchers at that time on how to influence basically behavior. And one of them, the last one, is if a member of your group disagrees with you, try and get him on board by sending him messages. But if he continues to disagree, then you got to kick him out. You got to eject him from the group. So that tactic or that strategy, or just knowing how to handle dissenters in certain group contexts, that's been around, forever.
Right. But you think that in academia, we should be following a different set of rules.
Right.
in fact, we want to have the dissenter. We should be welcoming the dissenter.
But that creates this unpleasant drive state that I want to...
I know, but see, academics are supposed to be trained.
It's supposed to be above that.
Yeah, we're supposed to be trained to be able to control that negative drive state. And in fact, to allow it to fuel us.
Right.
To use it
even
as...
seek it out.
Yeah, that's right. Because if you're never...
the Malhotra example you gave is a good example of that. Where you could view that as like the drive state could have created the impetus to dive deeper, to dig. Maybe it was an attempt to find constant information. You can't find the constant information, so you follow the trail where it leads, and then that's where you get the the breakthroughs or the change in paradigms or ideas.
Yeah. Okay.
The true scientist, maybe.
That's right. But we're all human. That's our downfall here.
Yeah. even scientific researchers are human. Yeah, maybe.
We're human too.
Exactly.
Okay. Second scenario we could call the free choice scenario.
Oh, okay.
And this arises when a person makes a decision to select one of 2 or more alternatives. And so these kinds of decisions, Festinger would say, always lead to some degree of dissonance. And that's because a person's choice is at odds with the desirable features of the rejected alternative and the undesirable features of the selected alternative. Right? So in either case, you're going to have some degree of dissonance. And what's interesting is that in this scenario, you can reduce dissonance in several ways that are maybe kind of unique to this scenario. The first is that you can change your view such that the rejected alternative is viewed less favorably and the chosen alternative is viewed more favorably. And this is a phenomenon called the spreading of alternatives. So you tend to now like more or have more positive predisposition to the things you've selected and a less positive predisposition to the things that you rejected. So that's creating an attitude change in you about the alternatives. And the second one is you can, I'm quoting here from Festinger, establish cognitive overlap among the alternatives involved in the choice. Okay, so effectively, if you could say, well, they're actually quite similar alternatives, then the choice itself becomes less important.
Right.
And so you don't experience as much. Yeah, you don't experience. So you might say, okay, so I'm thinking like, let's say in the context of the pandemic, right? You get the vaccine, you don't get the vaccine. No big deal, right? It probably doesn't do much, but it doesn't hurt you either. So who cares? So
right.
Whichever way that turns out, it doesn't matter because those are similar alternatives. You don't experience much dissonance. So again, you're doing some cognitive gymnastics here in order to bring these things actually more closer to each other. So you can either separate them or bring them closer to each other.
That's a good one. So this is one that I see very much applicable to very early on in the pandemic. I see this as being very applicable to sort of 2020, before some of the more heavy-handed measures came in, before the pressure, before some of the mandates, where you had a choice. You had a choice to opt in or not opt in, right? Yep. So I found this one particularly helpful in retrospect for understanding some of what was happening with respect to, I think, information and behavior at that point. Because the way I see it, particularly the spreading of alternatives, if people were voluntarily picking a certain set of behaviors or certain things to do, let's say very, very early on, before anything really took off, if somebody was making adjustments to their behavior with respect to canceling things or not doing certain things they like to do, so maybe canceling trips, canceling family gatherings, not doing this, maybe not going to the gym, not doing things they liked, and sort of willingly and voluntarily making a choice to not do stuff. And a particularly important thing about this is you make a choice, and it's not easy to then switch your choice. You can't just then say, oh, I don't like this option, I'm going to go back to the other option. So once you cancel the trip, once you stop going to the gym, once you stop doing things you like to do, going out to restaurants or what have you, that's gone. You made that choice. You committed. You can't then go back and do it. So then by doing so, the alternative of, not doing it, you want to create the situation where you spread those alternatives, right? You want to make it so that your choice was the right choice, was the best choice. So you want to spread the alternatives. And one way to spread the alternatives would be to seek out as much consonant information to support the idea that this is this is very serious. The pandemic is life or death. And it's going to effectively create a marketplace for the sky is falling type of information. So yes. The imperial model, you're going to love it. You're going to want it. That's going to support, I did the right thing. I was in the right. I made the best choice to do these things that prior to that, they were freely opted into. So you could have done it. You could have not done it. You chose not to do it. Because you chose not to do it, there's the possibility for dissonance. You want to spread the alternatives. Therefore, you want to seek out that consonant information to support how severe it is, i.e. how right you were in making those sacrifices, doing those things. So for me, that was a particularly insightful, or it gave me a lot of insight in terms of understanding this idea of, not trying to find balanced information on both sides, not trying to get to the bottom of stuff, not trying to find the truth, but kind of going wholesale on a certain idea, on a certain framework without considering alternatives that may have happened, right away, right at launch, because perhaps some of these behaviors were already being engaged in that leads to that drive state to seek out that information or certain types of information and ignore other types of information. So you're not going to want to care. You're not really going to want to hear about somebody who's out there saying, you know what, the infection fatality rate's not that bad. Maybe this, maybe that, maybe we want to reconsider. You're like, no. I just did all this stuff I can't take back. I wish I had done it, but I can't take it back. I want to know I was right in doing that.
Right. And it's important to point out that this actually works both ways, regardless of how you decide. So for instance, imagine
Yes.
you were someone who said, no, I'm not taking the vaccine. Right. Well, now you justify that by starting to gain information that tells you this vaccine's going to kill everybody in the end. That's, and so you're going to see that choice as being the critical choice, as being very important and the right choice. You're going to try to surround it with evidence that the choice you made was correct. You're going to inflate the potential damaging nature of the vaccine or the negative side effects. And you're going to deflate the effectiveness. Whereas if you're the one who took the vaccine, it's going to be exactly the opposite. You're going to say it's really, really effective. There's hardly any side effects. Yeah. Those are dynamics that emerge out of this sort of dissonance type framework.
It stands to reason, but particularly in light of the framework, it's hard to imagine somebody who freely, willfully was an early adopter to the vaccine, taking it, and then saying, you know what, let me get online, let me go to the literature, let me dig through this clinical trial data to see if there's any signals I should be aware of or any issues with some of the safety data I should be aware of. There's not going to be much incentive or motivation to do that. Right. It's almost unfathomable that somebody would do that.
Yeah. Well, and what you would expect from the dissonance theory here is that people will magnify the evidence consistent with their choice. People on both sides are subject to this kind of a bias, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's so interesting with the free choice paradigm is this is thought to apply like anytime any decision is made about anything. So the classic paradigm sort of use these like consumer behavior decisions about like product A, product B. So it doesn't even have to be, it's basically any time a choice is made one way or the other, which is why I think it's mostly applicable to early phases before requirements and policies came into effect, where they effectively, remove the choice. And we could speak to another paradigm that might feed into that as well.
Yeah. And just maybe a final point on this one is that this free choice paradigm dynamic, I think, might explain why you get the slippery slope or this kind of daisy chaining of decisions, right? So let's say, because if you think about the pandemic, it started out with kind of smaller choices, less consequential, and then they kind of grew and grew and grew and grew, right? Ultimately, you're like locking down, people are getting fired, you're taking these medications over and over and over again. And so like, how does this paradigm explain that? Well, one way would be is that your first choice that you make, like, I'm going to comply with this class of interventions, or I'm not going to comply. And then if you comply, well, now you're actually trying to, you see that as a much more positive alternative. So when things are now introduced that are consistent, another decision where an outcome is consistent with the outcome of your first decision, well, you're going to choose that outcome because it's going to be consonant with what you did before. And so there you just keep daisy chaining these decisions. And then so it's very possible to start by asking someone to make a very small decision. And then a slightly bigger decision, and then you can effectively veer them or guide them in one direction. It's kind of like the foot in the door technique. That remember,
it's going to snowball.
Cialdini, who talks about this persuasion techniques, right? You start with something small, and then you can make it grow, and you can direct somebody to continue to make choices along a certain side of a debate or a choice scenario.
So long as each subsequent decision point is consonant with the previous one.
That's right.
Then you can just chain them together. I think this, I think that sort of chain idea could also explain, or at least the spreading alternatives idea could explain some of the resistance to lifting restrictions and removal of certain policies, because effectively what happens under that situation is now it's harder to spread the alternatives, because maybe some of the rationalization for engaging in certain behaviors early on or finding the constant information is, if you don't do that, then look what happens. You don't get to do all these things. You don't get access to these things. But once those negatives get removed from the alternative that you didn't choose, now all of a sudden it's harder to say that your choice was the better choice or the superior choice.
Right.
So it could just, the removal of things or freeing up restrictions from a choice or doing something to a choice you had nothing to do with could create dissonance in you by virtue of the fact that it's making it harder for you to spread alternatives.
Spread alternatives in that case. Okay, how about we go to the third scenario?
All right.
So this is the induced compliance scenario. The induced compliance scenario.
Induced compliance. Does that sound relevant at all?
I know. Induced compliance. I like that terminology.
Yeah.
So here we consider a situation in which dissonance can occur when a person is goaded or coerced, maybe by threat of punishment or promises of reward, into acting in a way that contradicts that person's previously held private views. Okay, so you're exerting some coercive pressure in order to make somebody behave in a way that's different than their initial private views. And an important factor in this scenario is the magnitude or the strength of the inducements, or so particularly the severity of the punishment and or the attractiveness of the reward. So if the inducement is too high, people's compliance will generate little dissonance discomfort because they'll just attribute their compliance to the external inducement. But this is the interesting part. If the inducement is just enough to trigger compliance, So it's a bit of a kind of a shove, but it's just enough to trigger compliance. Then the person is much more likely to experience a high degree of dissonance discomfort because they might attribute their inconsistent action partly to themselves and as that they chose to operate in contradiction to their prior beliefs. Mm-hmm. And according to Festinger, there are two chief ways that people will reduce dissonance discomfort in these situations. So there could be, and I'm quoting here, subsequent change of private opinion to make it consonant with the overt behavior. Okay, so you were pushed into doing something that you previously would have disagreed with, but now you're going to change your belief to be consistent with the behavior that you were coerced into engaging in. Okay, so that's number one. Or there can be, and I'm quoting again, magnification of the reward or punishment to increase the consonance with the overt compliant behavior. Those are the kind of two ways that you deal with it. So, Jeff, what are some examples of this scenario in terms of COVID?
This is a particularly interesting one because as you highlighted, it seems it's all about the sweet spot in terms of the incentive. So turning the dial up to 11 and going with full coercion isn't going to create the dissonance. It's the subtler it is, the more dissonance that gets created. I think that's one of the more interesting points about this particular paradigm is that it seems quite counterintuitive, but then when you delve deeper, it makes total sense because if you can't externalize the reason for doing something, then the attribution has to be, I must have wanted to do it. And if I wanted to do this thing, it didn't take me much to do this thing that I really didn't think I wanted to do, but I did it. So maybe I really did want to do it. So yeah, maybe it wasn't so bad. Maybe I really liked it. Maybe it's, I'm going to change as a result of it. And I really see this as being applicable to a lot of the nudge literature we've talked about, where if you can kind of dial in different manipulations, different nudges that are going to be just enough to get somebody to do something, then you're going to do some more dissonance. And then by getting people to do certain things, you're going to create more buy-in for doing those things. So you're going to kind of create more willing participants. You're not going to induce any sort of resentment or hostility for getting people or complying or forcing people to do these different things. So effectively having these basically concentric manipulations over the course of time that are each one is going to capture a new group of people, a new group of people, a new group of people. As you sort of work your way out in terms of the severity of some of these manipulations, you're growing your group of people to go along with this thing willingly, and you're inducing attitude change while you're doing it. So you're sort of getting this win-win where you're getting people to do the behaviors you want, but in addition to getting them to do the behaviors you want, they're changing their beliefs and their attitudes to think more in line with the way you want them to think. So they're going to be more compatible, more compliant with the policies. So I think that's a really interesting marriage between, seeing it this way, the marriage between nudge and dissonance, in that you can kind of see some of the nudge manipulations through this dissonance framework. And I think it creates an interesting way of understanding something as large a scale as the nudges and manipulations we've seen in the pandemic, where it's very comprehensive and it's very pervasive, and that sort of macro approach in itself is effective because of dissonance, or dissonance theory can be used to explain why such an approach would be quite effective.
Yeah, and maybe these sort of subtle coercive techniques are the most effective if you get in right early on in an issue, before the person actually gets the opportunity or the chance to really identify what their beliefs are in this case. With regard to masks, for instance, or vaccination, people might be like, well, I don't know. And then if you just get a bit of a nudge, right, you don't have to overcome a lot to get them to comply with that. And then now, once they've complied, their attitude follows their behavior. Mm-hmm. And now you're on that whole kind of slippery slope trajectory, right? Where they're now going to look for constant information for that choice. They're going to double down on that belief, and then off you go, right? They're going to own that belief now. and off you go. So I think if I was a manipulator, I would make sure I got my messaging out there before people had a chance to actually firmly establish their clear view on something, and nudge them, just coerce them just a little bit into an action, and because then that's the way I would essentially get them on the hook, and then I can now increase progressively the magnitude of the choices, right, or the importance of the choices, and you can lead them down whatever path you need them to go.
Yeah. There's another paradigm that was mentioned. It's related to this one, and I think it's an interesting one. It's kind of a reverse coded version of this, where it's called the forbidden toy paradigm, where the idea is you present children with the opportunity to play with toys, but there's a threat of punishment if they play with a desirable toy. And then what ends up happening is the evaluation of that desirable toy ends up becoming, the toy ends up being perceived as less desirable. So if you're going to be threatened with punishment for doing something that's desirable, you're going to see that thing that you once saw as desirable as being less desirable. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So I thought of this paradigm particularly in the context of the pandemic, where you say, okay, you know, what would be the nice toy in this context? It'd be something like maybe like freedom or bodily autonomy. But if you want to play around with this shiny nice toy of freedom or bodily autonomy, you're gonna get punished. So you say, okay, you know what? I'm just gonna leave that there. I'm going to sort of abdicate those ideas. And then you might say, you know what, that freedom and autonomy stuff, that's kind of overrated anyways.
Yeah.
I didn't really like that in the first place. Or maybe it's not as nice as I thought it would be. So that shiny
I don't really care much about freedom.
Yeah, you know, like who's to say, you know, maybe we can get into
who's ever free anyways?
Yeah, is it really exactly. It's like, oh, I give up my bodily autonomy all the time. The argument's like I put on a seatbelt.
That's right.
You know, so it's kind of, it's not so great. So I thought that forbidden toy one is particularly interesting because it can kind of, it's the same idea, but it, like I said, it kind of reverses it, where you get prevented from doing something you would normally have, with no restrictions, you'd love to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's the one way you can deal with this. The dissonance in these scenarios, according to Festinger, is to magnify the reward or the punishment. So I'm thinking of an example of that. Like, so imagine that you didn't want to take the vaccine, but there's a mandate, let's say at work, and you're like, okay, this is a real punishment that will occur if I don't take the vaccine, right? You may ultimately, if you take the vaccine, because of that, say, that I would have certainly lost my job in that case, right? Like, it was necessary because my whole life would have fell apart, my livelihood, right? That kind of a notion. So you'd sort of magnify that. Or if you're given some sort of an incentive, you would say, well, that incentive was so important that I had to do this, right? Because who can give up that incentive? So yeah, you get this kind of magnification even of, there's so much of this dissonant stuff going on in these scenarios, right? It's like it's dripping with dissonance.
It's a fire hose of dissonance. Yeah.
Okay. We have time for one more scenario, maybe?
Yeah, which one do we have left here? Let me see.
It's the effort justification scenario. Okay, so the effort justification scenario involves a person exerting effort on an undesirable task in order to achieve a valued goal. Okay, so you're going to make some effort to do something you don't want to do to achieve something that you want. And the dissonance arises because the person does something they find undesirable. And the degree of the dissonance increases with the amount of effort exerted on that undesirable task. I have a quote here from Harmon, Jones, and Mills. Quote, dissonance can be reduced by exaggerating the desirability of the outcome, which would add consonant cognitions. So in this case, you've exerted so much effort for something, it must have been worth it.
It was worth it.
In fact, it was so valuable to me, right? And you magnify the value of that final outcome. Do you have a pandemic application, Jeff?
See, this one is an interesting one. I see this one as the parallel I see here is sort of any kind of like initiation ritual. Like you got to do this thing you don't want to do to get access to this other stuff. And I think you could basically go down the list, depending on where somebody was with their attitudes or their ideas. I think you could probably go down the list of like, wearing a mask, testing, social distancing, all those things potentially could have been seen as, very unpleasant or distasteful, but you got to do those things in order to get access to polite society and your workplace and what have you. So I think many of the policies or the restrictions or the interventions could be seen from a effort justification paradigm where I don't think anything that was done was on its face could be seen as pleasant.
Think about the effort and sacrifice that went into lockdowns, right? Isolation, lost
it's a lot
income,
of effort.
lost jobs, restriction of movement. Of course, they must have been effective,
right?
Or think about like if you're taking the vaccine and the vaccine. This is very interesting because some people felt like a flu-like symptoms after taking the vaccine for let's say a day or so, right? Kind of wiped them out for a while. That must mean it's working,
right?
This is all really good.
The worse the feeling, the better it must have been working.
And if I didn't do this, then I would surely die of COVID, or there's a high probability that I would get really sick and the sickness is really bad.
Yeah.
Or think about the discomfort that comes in wearing a mask and like making sure it's like fit all the time and the communication problems or whatever, right? Like that's a lot of effort that goes into that. Of course, this must be valuable and protective.
Yeah. So then you make the prediction from this paradigm that the ones who found it potentially most displeasing, most uncomfortable would experience the the strongest, would have the strongest justification about their effectiveness, let's say.
Yeah. If you complied and you really did it with a lot of effort and discomfort and dislike, think about the keeping 6 feet apart all the time, following the arrows everywhere you went, all this kind of stuff. Like with all that effort, wouldn't it be completely absurd if none of it actually had much effectiveness? Like, of course it must be very, very important. Yeah. And look, even if it then is like 5% effective, that's an important 5%.
It's very, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. It's 5%.
Think about how much bigger 5 is than 0. Like that's right. Infinite magnitude.
Right.
Well, one potential view of dissonance that could provide some indication for where and when it's most likely to occur comes from this idea that it's most activated. So dissonance is most activated when it implicates somebody's self-concept as being a morally good person. So if the dissonance is a result of a conflict between perceptions that somebody is a good moral person, there's some ideas out there that's when you're sort of at that sweet spot for creating dissonance. And some of these ideas go back, 50s and 60s, but I just wanted to get this in there because it has implications to some of the other stuff we've talked about, namely the Milgram study with the executants and what happens when somebody's self-concept about being a morally good person is actually threatened, and that creates a dissonance, and it could be potentially a particularly strong set of dissonance. So this comes from a study that was done, or some of the stuff was covered by a couple of researchers, so Cooper and Fazio, as well as Glass. So Cooper and Fazio, and then Glass 1964. So basically the idea here is this comes from a summary chapter by Aronson. So I'll just read it here. So in this study, so this is the Glass study, people were put in a situation where they were induced to deliver a series of electric shocks to people. So that sounds familiar, right? Sounds very Milgramy. They then had the opportunity to evaluate their victims. So you're in this situation, you administer shocks based on, whether or not somebody, agrees with you. And dissonance theory predicts that if individuals are feeling awful about having hurt someone, One way to reduce the dissonance is to convince themselves that their victim is a dreadful person who deserves to suffer the pain of the electric shock. So what Glass found was precisely that those individuals who had the highest self-esteem who derogated their victims the most. Now here's where Aronson highlights the nice irony. He said, it is precisely because I think I'm such a nice person that if I do something that causes you pain, I must convince myself that you are a rat. In other words, because nice guys like me don't go around hurting innocent people, you must have deserved every nasty thing I did to you. So this idea that when the behavior that you can get somebody to do or somebody does is inconsistent with the idea that they're a good moral person, that in some way the behavior caused harm to another person. And one of the insights about this perspective is particularly relevant to the other paradigms, where some of the other dissonance paradigms, you basically ask people to lie or induce people to lie, tell people that you get people to tell other people a task was very interesting or exciting. So the behavior is actually potentially harming or having implications for another person. And these researchers would argue that particular aspect of creating harm in another person based on your actions is fundamentally what creates the dissonance or could be responsible for creating a lot of the dissonance. So that was a particularly interesting intersection between some of the other manipulations we've talked about and dissonance. We can understand, let's say, the Milgram study, perhaps we talked about this through dissonance ideas as well. It could be an interesting lens as well to understand some of the pandemic dimensions, because as we talked about, a lot of the interventions, they weren't neutral. They did in fact cause harm.
That's really interesting, especially like the link to Milgram, because one of the findings that we talked about there was that the executant would devalue the participant who was being shocked.
Totally,
right? They would dehumanize them a little bit, devalue them.
So based on all this, one thing I wanted to ask you about, Dan, was based on what we've learned about dissonance, what do you think, how do things look with respect to what are the prospects about getting people to be on the same page with some of this information? Do you think there's hope for getting people on the same page with some of the pandemic information?
Well, I think, okay, so that's an interesting question. I think I would go back to Fessinger's claim that fundamentally one important factor is reality. And he does point out that some beliefs and actions are more resistant to reality than others, right?
Right.
So
he covers it all. He covers it.
Right. But the point is that reality still seems to affect attitude change in the end. If reality becomes clear and the person is faced and has to confront that reality, that has the power to basically make them align with reality. And so I think the only way...
Or double down with...
Right, exactly. But I'm thinking the only way out of this to get people to agree is to have a very strong presence of reality. And this is where I think science has really failed in this regard, because they've become part of the whole sort of incentivized, dare I say the word, propaganda machine, because there's all these unholy alliances between big pharma, government funding, researchers, and so on. And so, but in a proper functioning scientific community, that they're producing the data that provides some fundamental reality. When that becomes strong and clear to the point that it's unassailable, then you can have everybody shifting, and aligning themselves, or more people aligning themselves with that reality. But maybe that's too much to hope for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting, because I hadn't thought of it through that lens, but I think a lot of the early and continuing appeals to, follow the science were effectively trying to, you can see this basically trying to do what you're saying, where you're saying, okay, no, this is reality. Like, science is telling us what reality is, so there we need to get in line. You need to get in line with reality. Yeah.
But the problem is, of course, again, is that was too early, because science can't work that fast to produce, reliable information at that kind of a speed typically, right? So it was kind of like a false hope, I would say, in science. But then that the political cartoon that comes to mind is the person saying follow the science. So the person is following the scientist, and the scientist is following, big pharma and government and so on, right? So it's like science itself is being led by these alternative interests. Mm-hmm. And this is a bigger topic maybe to be discussed another time. But in the scientific community, this is framed in a very positive way. We talk about partners, partnering with industry, partnering with government. And the idea is, in some sense, a very good idea, right? Because if we can just leverage all of our different skills and resources together, we can do a lot. So there's a very positive reason why people are trying to develop those partnerships. But the problem is it then contradicts another important factor in academia, which is independence. Because now academia can start to be biased by the demands and requirements of these other partners, of these other actors. And then we lose the important independence that I think we assume is present there when it comes to, delivering knowledge that's unbiased. So anyways, that's a topic for another whole discussion. Mm-hmm. And so maybe it's too much to hope for in the short run to have science produce enough evidence to clarify a reality that everybody can agree on. But maybe it'll come at some point.
All right. So is there anything else you want to cover on the topic of dissonance?
I think we did a pretty good job looking at the details in this more than an hour-long episode. So maybe we should leave it there.
All right. That sounds good. All right. Thanks, Dan.
All right, Jeff. I'll talk to you later.